everybody to this meeting of the BCF SPA. The last one before August, the summer break. For anybody who has not been here before, emergency exits are through there, and depending on where the fire is, might go right or left. Toilets are through there and to the right and to the right again. After this meeting, we said, well, we're going to have pizza, wine, other drinks, atrium, and if you go on beyond 8:45, you're going to go to a pub called the Old Dr. Butler's Head, which is about 5 minutes walk from here, to show you where to go. In about 20 minutes, I'll stand up and head count and find out who wants to eat what for their pizza, whether there are any special dietary requirements. I know about yours, Derek. I'd like to thank Dr. Andrew Harwell Law for coming along tonight and it's about architecture. You know the talk.
So I'm not a doctor. I definitely.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. That's fine. Only that's very flattering. But okay. I'll leave the okay at the top. Hopefully, I guess people can hear me online. I don't know where I'm speaking into. Is it clear? It's all clear here.
Yep.
So, and I'm also going to try and, the idea is this is kind of conversational. So there will be a few points where I'll stop. We'll see if anybody has any comments. If not, then there's definitely time for questions at the end. This talk has become, since I wrote this talk, has become a book, well, a blog post, then a book, which is what happens when you write things on Martin Fowler's website. And lots of the content of the talk has changed over the course of time, and lots of content in the book has changed over the course of time based on the conversations I've had with people. So I'm very, very keen to share people's experiences and feedback, particularly criticisms, as you'll hear in the talk. There's been a bunch of really interesting kind of feedback on it. So, but what I want to talk about is, as it says there, a commune in the Ivory Tower. So the thing that spawned what I'm going to talk about was the fact that I'm a consultant. I work for ThoughtWorks, and so been in consultancy for a long time. Over the course of my career, I typically get staffed as an architect. So an architect with various titles, but a systems architect, application architect, or software architect, or an enterprise architect, or different kinds of architect. And what I noticed was over the course of 18 years, or however long I've been doing consulting, the architectures that I was helping customers build and clients build were changing dramatically. And because I've been around for quite a long time, I'm old enough to have worked for Sun Microsystems when Sun Microsystems still existed. So lots of the kind of the standard things that you would do, the right ways of doing things, had become wrong ways of doing things. So it was expensive to procure computers and compute resource, and it was very expensive to scale things up. So therefore you try and plan things in advance and figure out what you needed. Then the cloud came along, and suddenly that was a lot more dynamic. Again, when I started, we spent 6 months to a year building things. Now people are telling you to deploy multiple times a day if you want to be DORA elite, and many other things. So we'd have big, large software teams that were front-end teams and back-end teams. And now things like team topologies are telling you to split things along flow-aligned, stream-aligned teams, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of things have changed. Lots of things which were the right thing to do are now probably the wrong thing to do. And lots of things which would have seemed kind of worst practice have now become best practice. So lots of stuff has changed. And now I work for ThoughtWorks. You could attribute, I was just previously speaking to James Lewis in the office before I came. You could say that ThoughtWorks is responsible for some of these things, so which have caused good things to happen in software architecture. And if you've built any microservices, you might blame ThoughtWorks for some of those things. So all of those things have changed. But what I realized was I would join client project. All of these things had changed. So all of the thought workers were working with clients, making stream-aligned, continuously deploying cloud-native teams with their cloud-native application. Software architecture, the expectation from the clients, my role and what I was supposed to do and how I was supposed to do it. And so as the thought workers were there and other consultancies are available, lots of the kind of the standard way of delivering software these days didn't feel like it fit for how I was doing things. So what was happening was, as opposed to a resident of a, I never got to work in an ivory tower, but as opposed to the mimetic cliche of the fact that this is like easy, cushy job where you just kind of create PowerPoint slide decks and then throw them out the window and assume that they were going to get built. It felt more and more to me like I was a bottleneck, like I was a blocker, like I was getting in the way. Teams were needing to move forward. They were needing more and more architecture, and I was not a very good architect, but I was not capable of being in all the right places at all the right times. So this is the slide that Diana Montelian refers to as my overdramatic slide. But like, so this wasn't me, but I was losing sleep. It's stressful being an architect because, as I said, when you do microservices, for instance, and that's, James Lewis is partially responsible for that because he wrote one of the original blog posts defining microservices. You don't do microservices and need less architecture. You do microservices and need a lot more architecture. For instance, if you go to the cloud, you don't need less architecture, you need more architecture, in my opinions. But I was having sleepless nights because you need more architecture, but then there's kind of me trying to do the traditional approach to architecture, and I'm a bottleneck, I'm an anchor, I'm getting in the way. As it shows here, I've obviously discovered how to use emojis in slide decks. I was getting in the way, but this was the thing, as I moved faster, there was no reduced need for architecture. The need for architecture, if I managed to work with a team and managed to sit down with them long enough to do some domain-driven design or do something to kind of find the boundaries of their microservice or to figure out what the life cycle of what they were doing was, or all of these important things that you do, figure out what the systemic qualities was so that their services could scale elastically, et cetera, to try and get that into the designs, to try and get it into the code. That was more needed because when it went wrong, go wrong even more spectacularly, even more expensively, even more stressfully. So the key point was there was still a massive value in doing architecture, but the traditional approaches that I was being expected to use to approach architecture were definitely dead. So what did I do? This is true. So the previous picture is not an actual picture of me trying to get some sleep, but this is kind of true. So what I did was I sat down and I thought, if I was a systems architect and I was trying to architect the flow of work or the things that I was doing, I would take a blank piece of paper and I would sit down and figure out what was going on. So if you sit down with access to emojis from the internet and create a diagram of what happens, what you end up with, in my experience, different experiences are available, but in my experience, you would end up with something like this. So in the traditional way that teams mostly organize these days, there are teams who have a need for a decision to be made. It's either a structural decision or like, what are the interfaces for this service that we're providing, or what are our dependencies, or what are the systemic qualities, or what construction technologies do we use? All the kind of things that Michael Nygaard talks about in his ADR's blog post. You need to that decision. So I was the person responsible and accountable for those decisions. So they would come to me. I am the bottle in this diagram. We might draw some diagrams because this is before COVID. We would draw some pictures on a whiteboard. We'd all come to a common understanding. The team would now have their decision, and they would then implement that decision, and they would get down into code, green tick, everything's brilliant.
Sounds a bit simple.
Exactly right. So the simple thing is, I was never staffed, especially probably because I was more expensive than the other regular human beings. Consultant, they'd expect me to be in multiple teams at multiple times. So multiple teams would be coming along. They would be asking me questions or needing decisions. They'd come to me. This time we might write stuff on the wiki because we'd like some nice clean documentation. Maybe it was like C4 or something, which I was using today. Again, they have the decision. We're all good. We all understand it. They implement it. It goes into production. So in this miraculous imaginary world, our shared understanding has made it into code. It doesn't always happen, but in this example it has. But even then, when it gets into code and when they put it into production, they're learning things about this, the nature of the architecture, how it works, how it performs when it gets beyond the kind of deterministic world of code out into the non-deterministic world of running systems with users and data and all of the kind of stuff that make our lives difficult. They've learned things, but I'm not there to learn it because I'm back speaking to another team who have another question which they need me to do because they're trying to scale me as an architect. So they want me to be in multiple places at multiple times. So now, new emoji, there's a backlog appearing in front of me. teams are coming to me, teams are either asking maybe questions, they don't even need a decision or approval or something to be taken, but they're just like asking for clarifications or whatever, or they've got another question. And this is where things start to go wrong. So number one, I start getting stressed. Number two, we have a conversation because I need to move fast. And so we're maybe sketching something very rapidly. We're spending less time doing what might be considered best practice for architecture, but they need to be able to get stuff into code because a product manager, because there's always product managers, are saying we need to ship this as rapidly as possible, do just the bare minimum architecture so we can get it there and we can iterate on it later. So who knows what ended up in production? We're hoping that it's the thing that we all agreed on, but I'm not even sure because I didn't spend very long with these people and we spent very little time sketching whatever kind of format of architecture. Who knows? But we still might be lucky, but inevitably something's going to go wrong. So this is the kind of thing that you might see happening, right? And this was my experience over and over again. This is why I was stressed. This is why lots of stuff is going on, because as consultants were coming in and showing people how to restructure their teams, how to split their architecture into smaller pieces so that teams could be building and running and deploying independently. More changes were happening more frequently. Rebecca Parsons writes a book about enterprise architecture. Lambda's come along, so it's not even microservices anymore. Everything's sharded into tiny, tiny pieces so that more of these independent things can be deployed at different times. So we're not just going through this kind of system with me in the middle very frequently. We're doing it more frequently because more decisions are happening more of the time over and over again. So even if we navigate through this path, this kind of choose your own adventure thing multiple times, and I'm really good and I'm on my like A game and I'm like getting enough sleep and all of these kind of things, inevitably some things are going to go wrong. So that's what stressed me out. So there's some key factors of this. If you look at this as if it's a software system, some things stand out. Number one, it's very, very serial. It has to go through this kind of key decision point in the middle, which is there for valid reasons, because we want to make sure we get a good, coherent, consistent architecture, but it's got to go through a bottleneck, right? If you were going to scale a system, this would not be a satisfying way of working. Another thing is, it's very kind of pull or push driven, like everything has to come to me. They have to push all decisions to me. They have to go through me because I'm accountable for the architect. It's very centralized, again, doesn't scale very well. And it's very like blocking, right? It's a blocking architecture. Go.
There's no feedback loop. So as you said before, the teams will learn things.
Right. So this is the thing. So it's like, it's not an optimal way of doing this, right? So I thought maybe, because I try and be humble, despite the fact that I work for authorities who sometimes have a reputation, I was like, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm not a good architect. Maybe but everyone else is better at this than me. So what was very cool was I got to do a DDD Europe. The organizer of DDD Europe said, would you like to do a keynote about this? But the idea was that the keynote, I would present this first 5 minutes of the talk, and then we would let the audience tell me and the other people I was on stage with, they would tell us what they thought. So I was very refreshed, and the data's open source. You can see it, like we collected all of the 800 attendees' responses to it. It was not just me. Lots of people, maybe not everyone, but lots of people were feeling this. And the faster they enabled their teams and the more decentralized their architecture are, the more this was happening. And the industry is not heading in a direction where we're centralizing and going slower. No one's asking us to take our time. Everyone's making us go fast. So that's where we are. What happens if we go back to a blank sheet of paper? If we go to a blank sheet of paper, things that are not going to change, in fact, they might scale up. There will be multiple teams who need decisions, they're doing architecture, and then some magic happens in this middle space, and then they end up with decisions which they put into code. So the question then is, what are the alternative architectures of decision making? If you were going to come up with something that's scaled, you would come up with something that's decentralized, parallel, right? And this kind of maps nicely to the whole promise of autonomous independent teams that everybody's expecting now because they've all read team topologies, et cetera, et cetera. So if we drop out to the kind of test-driven development way of doing design, if you like, if we list the criteria for what we want something which is a decentralized way to make decisions. And that's the thing that's going to sit in the middle here, right? Somehow good design is still going to be done. All of the right thinking is going to be done by all of the right people. All of the required expertise is going to be brought to bear so that you were going to move from this status to this status. Perfect. And then it goes into production. And it turns out there is a way of doing this. There are multiple ways of doing this. Since I've written my book, it's quite interesting. You write a book and then people come out of the woodwork who tell you that there's similar ways of doing things, which are not exactly what you've proposed, but they're similar. So this is one way, to be very clear. There are other ways which work equally well. The key point is they have this characteristic. The thing that I realized, and I did experiments with this and then tried it with bigger and bigger clients, there's an approach in what are called teal or trust organizations, which is called the called the advice process. I stuck the word architecture on the front of it and used the advice process. And so the characteristics are it's decentralized, it's pull-based, so therefore the people who need the decision bring in the architecture expertise as opposed to having to go to the architects for expertise. It ignores the need for consensus, which may trigger people here. So we can talk about that in a second when I use even more emojis. But it's also fundamentally, it's non-blocking. So as we know these days, non-blocking is not necessarily, doesn't make it easier, but it scales. So if we're trying to scale, this is a thing to do. So what is the advice process? The reason it's non-blocking is because this is the first statement, which may sometimes, if someone had proposed this to me and it wasn't me that came up with the idea, I would be terrified. So anyone can make a decision. Okay. However, we're not looking for chaos. We're looking for organized self-organizing anarchy, right? As in, there's no centralized kind of way of doing things. And I mean anarchy not in the general sense, but anarchy in the self-organizing, self-directed, self-responsibility taking way of approaching things. So to get that, you need to add two things. And this is the social contract. The social contract that comes with it is, if you make a decision, anyone here in this room can make a decision, but you promise to do two things so that I can trust that your decision is a good one. And then when I do the same thing, when I make a decision, I can trust your decision too. What you need to do is seek advice from all affected parties. And a nice rule of thumb I've learned from doing this is either A, you're going to spend someone's money that doesn't belong to you. So you're going to adopt some new technology and someone else is going to have to pay for it. Or you're going to do something that's going to make a ticket go in someone else's backlog. i.e. they're going to have to do work. So that's only polite. We're all, well, we might all be British, but like we're in the UK, so be polite. But not just all affected parties. The other thing you want to do is speak to people with expertise, because maybe there are people who are like, that's a terrible idea, whatever you're proposing. And I can tell you why. Because in 1987, when I was doing some COBOL for some large bank in the UK, we tried this and it blew up. So you want to get those people with expertise. So if you do this could be the short version of the talk. If you just do this, it just magically works. So we do that, we tick the box. This is the first interactive bit, if anyone has any comments. Obviously, you can probably come up with, and this was the second part of what was called the everybody keynote. We told people asked people how they felt about the practice of architecture. The second question was, if you did this, please come up with all of the reasons you can think this would go wrong. And there are many, many rows in the Google spreadsheet, where people can think of all of the reasons that go wrong. So obviously it can go wrong. So that's pause for breath while I just wait and see if everybody's still following. But this is the thing. The key kind of point that I want to make at this point is, if you do this, then obviously you need to be aware of these things, and I'll talk about like lots of mitigation strategies for this. What I typically get though is people are like, oh, we need to not do this. But the thing is, if you fall back to you could do other ways of kind of mapping something into this decentralized decision-making thing. If you go back to centralized is just going to get worse and worse. In my experience, but I see more of this in more and more clients. It's not scaling because we're trying to build decentralized architectures with independently self-managing teams. So we need something else to kind of still maintain cohesiveness, systemic kind of thinking and reasoning and all that kind of stuff. We'll see if there's any questions to make sure I've upset people appropriately. There's nothing online.
This might be an appropriate jump.
Yeah.
Take the housekeeping.
Oh yeah, good. Right, that's cool. Well, people let this sink in.
Thanks. So we currently have 11 participants online, including the ones that are here. How many have we got in the room? It's just right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 11. Let's count. Sorry, I have to do it in blocks. 3, 6, 9, 6. So that's 15 people. Is anybody with gluten intolerance? No. Eric's with pizza intolerance. Anybody else with pizza intolerance? We can order some chicken goujons or something like that. Yeah, okay. So that's 2 people then. And we'll get more than half the vegetarian ones anyway, so plenty of vegetarian plant-based options. Thank you. That's it.
So maybe you trust me, so maybe nobody's got any questions or any thoughts.
Well,
You're talking about different ways of changing. A lot of it is fashion driven. I mean, there's very little data showing that any of this works or is better than. So if it's all fashion driven, then you're just changing the fashion.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's definitely a response to the changing way that people are approaching things. And I've definitely been around long enough to have seen things come and go. The one thing I have seen though is when you get effective decentralized architecture with self-managing teams, which is a big, like self-managing teams, autonomous teams is a big deal. It's not, you don't magically get it. But one thing I've seen, and this is what I kind of talk about, and that we'll talk about not only like the things I would add to this to make this work, but also I'm going to talk about failure patterns, because it would be naive to just assume that human beings will always get on with each other and they'll high five in the corridor like some American movie. That's why the book is 460 pages. The first chunk of the book is about how to do it, and the rest of it is like, let's be honest, human beings are complicated, so therefore they make this difficult. When you get this, you know, like as architecture scale, there are obviously managing shared state is either very difficult or something you need to give up. You can get benefits from this, but it doesn't mean to be very clear, I am not saying this works in all circumstances. That would be naive.
Well, I'm not suggesting it doesn't work. I'm just saying, is it better than?
In my experience, it is, but I'm biased because it's something I gave a name to. So, but like the key thing is you see, and I'll talk about this, you see a greater ownership and understanding of architecture. That's my biggest thing. So
Yeah, but so what? The question is, does it deliver better value?
yes. So that's the thing, because my argument would be, it's a very good question though. There's Eric Dorenberg, a thought worker, was like, the architecture is not what you've drawn on the screen or on the wiki page. It's the thing that's running in production. So in my experience, there's no data for this.
You keep talking about the architecture and nobody cares about that. They care about the user experience.
So therefore, right, sorry, good question. So this does not, just like the 4 key metrics for DORA, if you have good 4 key metrics like your DORA Elite, you might be efficiently shipping very stable code, which might be completely useless. So this will, again, if you don't have a good idea and a good understanding of what your users want, this will just make you more efficient and make what's in everyone's head more closer to what's in production. It might still be completely useless. So that's very good. Sorry, someone at the back was.
Well, I don't know. I was thinking an analogy might be, for example, projects that are set up in agile sprints. And those are like little projects that get to a bigger thing. Yeah. But those projects, in my experience, are like self-managing teams because they're all trying to work out how to do something.
Yeah, exactly. And this maps, like, someone who was trying to upset me, like in a friendly way, they were like, have you not just like redescribed agile with like a little slightly different perspective and secret sauce? It could be argued, like in the old days, people used to say, it's just agile done right, or agile with a small a. You could very much argue this is just going, let's just trust people, because back in the day, we all understood what we were building and we would converse with each other. Heaven forbid we'd actually have a conversation about the architecture. This is, in more respects than anything else, is reacting to the fact that because human beings love to kind of structure things in a hierarchical way, we decided that there would be a smaller number of human beings who would be doing the big thinking, and then they would tell the people below them to do the implementation. Which I don't think anyone ever thought worked, right? When you did see a high-performing team, it was already collaborating and doing these things. This is just a kind of mental way of thinking about doing that. And to the point, it's still not going to give you good software if you don't play it. But it gets, hence I use the word anarchy, which again is a big word. But the key point is if people are taking, like Netflix would call freedom and responsibility is freedom, but you then have responsibility. It doesn't, suddenly if you decide, then it's your responsibility for the fact that you've decided to use lambdas as opposed to EKS or something.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, and you might come on to this, sort of consistency is often more important than having the right individual point solution.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that
Totally, but this is
centrally coordinated. It kind of is a thing.
exactly. So that's great because that is literally the thing I'm going to come on to. So the things actually I've got a list which this doesn't include, but I'll talk about that. So this is good and it works, but a lot of things work, but they're not like going to work necessarily in a good way. So for example, you might get drift, you might get like some projects I've started on, like startups especially, or scale ups, they've run with something that's kind of ad hoc like this, and like anyone can build anything using any technology they want, and they realize that they've gone for an accidental multi-cloud strategy because one team built something on Azure and another team built something on AWS, and another team have like spun something up on the server under their desk because they didn't give them these. I don't like the word guardrails because guardrails are like we told you not to, but like paved roads is good, right? We've made this easier for you. You can get completely. So things that you definitely realize, because anyone can decide, there's a reason why people become architects, because you just get put in the position where over the course of time, you get to make these big decisions. So you get experience in making these decisions. People who haven't done that might not know all the things to worry about, all the things to think about, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to support those people, number one, to make this work better. Number two, and this might kind of branch out to what you're saying, if we're asking for advice, it would be really nice to know who is giving their advice. So we're like, oh, they've gone and spoken to Bob. Bob knows about this stuff, so we can see what Bob said. So we're cool, we can leave it. We know that Bob said, please don't use AWS because we haven't paid for it. And you can't use your credit card to put something on. It may have worked for a client where someone got fed up and put something, paid for their credit card, which was terrifying. But yeah, so you want to know, right? You want to know to be able to see what things are happening.
And maybe knowing whose opinion is more relevant or not. So I think the architect is often steps up a level, kind of understands a bit more about the organization and that kind of thing.
100%. So this is literally, I'll talk about this because this is the thing. Things that you get when you're an architect, which I think you don't, well, maybe you all appreciate it yourselves. I don't see written down enough. One of the things that architects have is experience. You've just made mistakes and learned from your mistakes, right? Number two, you know a bunch of people who everyone else, like someone in a team, might not know because you've been around longer, because typically that's how it works, right? So this kind of thing is key, right? You definitely want to know that, oh, they don't know the organizational maps. They don't know who. Because it's never, every time I see an org chart, it's never up to date. It's always could be a new version. Or the key people, more importantly, the key person you should talk to who's got like a gaming chair and never comes into the office and seems to live in semi-darkness, they're definitely the person you always need to go to speak to if you're going to do anything to the PL SQL, but they're nowhere on the org chart, right? They're like somewhere down in like just, you know, dev world. They're definitely the person there, or the person like the Brent in the Phoenix project, right? They're never high in the org chart, but they know what they need to do. And you want to know what all decisions are, because if suddenly there's a lot of decisions going on, so if we're successful, there's more decisions. But like you said, there will be people who are still, lots of these teams are going to be making decisions that make their lives easier, but there's still the overall system. No one is ever, you know, you're not working for separate companies. You're all working for the same, trying to build something valuable, right? You could still have all the input for a valuable system, but then everyone builds their bits and you get the kind of classic, you know, the swing cartoon where like the swing is barely being a swing. So you want to know about that. So what do we do? So this again, I'm going to steal something brazenly from that already exists from the outside world. I've had feedback when I was at OOP in Munich. Not everyone knows what an ADR is. So an ADR is a lightweight architectural decision record. I'm sure everyone does, but just to be sure, you can tick all of these boxes using lightweight ADRs. So how do you do that? Quickly, I'll talk just so people aren't aware. And I did mess around. I've basically taken what Michael Nygaard said, and I've not added anything to it. Everybody does add things, but which is good. But there's a kind of set of fundamental things I think are important. Number one, they need an ID and a title, because otherwise people talk about the same ADR and it turns out they're talking about different ADRs. Things I've learned, when you suddenly create this flowering of ADRs, no one has enough time to read all of them. So if the title of the ADR says what the decision was, so here we are decided to use short inventory IDs, then you can read your way down a list and it's more like a change log of everything that's changed. If you're like, whoa, that sounds bad. We're going to adopt MongoDB, even though someone decided 3 years ago we definitely wouldn't. Then you can click into it, but you can see it in the title.
Couple of observations. two figures,
Yes.
two digits is not usually long enough.
You're
And
right.
also, don't put these in your repository because that way lies hell, because you need to go to a pull request to actually get it approved.
This is good. That's like, I normally reserve that for upsetting people later on. I totally agree. So like, this is the thing. So at least Confluence is good because number one, I totally agree they need to be in dev tooling. Putting them, like, if you put them in SharePoint, it's where developers never go. So therefore you've already said, I don't care about what you think. SharePoint's bad. Unless you're like some unicorn company where everyone loves working in SharePoint, which I've never seen, but maybe it does. I totally agree about the IDs. I should update the slide. See, that's really bad. That's terrible. So, because there's going to be more than 90. If this succeeds, there's more than 99 IDs. So Confluence is good, or another wiki thing. What you want is, and you'll see in a second, the advice to live with the thing. If the advice in a pull request, it might disappear. You want people who aren't, for example, someone who's with expertise, might be a product manager. Product manager is not, they might click on a link to GitHub. If you're lucky, they've got a login to GitHub. And if you're lucky, they've got the permission to comment on ADR. It is not natural for some of those people, or someone from finance, or someone from regulatory, or whatever. They are not, they're like, what is this weird tool and what have you asked me to do? Confluence looks like things they recognize. Or controversially, I've written this up in my book, and some people think it's an amazing idea. Some people hate it. You can create a ticket type in Jira, or other work item management things are available. And then you can enforce statuses. You can do querying on like how long an ADR has been open and all that kind of stuff. I worked with someone once who was an architect, but their previous job was as a tech writer. The Confluence pages they created based on some very clever queries and some very nice kind of marshalling of all of the data was perfection. It was amazing. Some people are like, don't make me go to Jira any more than I already have to. But you can, there's nice ways of doing it. So next, and this is the next thing I messed around with from Michael Nygaard, following the kind of basic philosophy of like newspaper articles. If you read, the least thing you want to read is the title. If you want to click in, the next thing I want to know is what was decided, not the context. So the next thing I have is the context, is the decision. The next thing is the context. So like what were the forces, what was the circumstances which were present when I had to decide this, make this decision. So I've just flipped those from Michael Nygaard. More detail. Next thing, options considered. So anti-parasites, which I'm not sure why they exist, but people will list one option because they won't list the options that they've discounted. They just list the option. These things are a record of decisions. So really, 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 you want to see, we've thought of 3 things and then we didn't number 2 or 3 or 4 because reasons. See the reasons in a second, which are the consequences. You want to have, again, anti-patterns are, you'll see people like the option, the option they think is awesome has all positives, all pros and no negatives. The options they hate have all negatives and no consequences. As we all know, architectural decisions are wicked. There is never just one option, and there is never the best thing to do and nothing else. Other things I've learned, deciding to not do anything and to leave the status quo is a very powerful thing. When you're trying to look back, and this might be because I'm a consultant where I come in and help people fix things. If you have you wonder why did nobody decide to do this? If you've got a bunch of kind of intermittent ADRs for key things, it's like, we know this hurts, we know this is suboptimal, but it's the best thing we have and we don't have the capabilities or the time or the budget or whatever. Deciding to do nothing is a nice thing to have written down. If it's a key thing, you don't need to do it fine, but like those are really useful. So again, consequences, et cetera. And then the thing I've added to Michael Nygaard's thing is in the comment section of the wiki page, you add advice. There's a really nice blog post, which I need to link into to something somewhere. The person who wrote a beautiful puzzle, whose name I can't remember, but they're like a CTO/tech lead. They write books for O'Reilly. They wrote an amazing blog post on how to comment on technical documents. And I need to share it afterwards, but it's like, don't comment as you work down the document, because then you can you'll be complaining that something doesn't exist, and then down here you'll be adding comments which go, oh, I found it's further down the document. It's a really nice kind of workflow, mental workflow for like adding value to things, because what you want is people to offer the advice. This is where the advisors put their advice in the context of the ADR. So they can maybe link it to something contextual, but they can say, I think this, I think that, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have this historical record of who said what, when, what were their criteria. The advice doesn't just need to be on don't use Mongo, it's terrible, or I mean, I have nothing against MongoDB, but it's just a random example, or use Java, it's very fast, don't use .NET, I don't like capitalization of method names. This kind of stuff, all of this can go in here. The best way that works in my experience is the people who are taking the decision and writing the ADR are responsible for identifying the advisors. The advisors are responsible for writing down their advice. Because if you write it down for them, you might misinterpret what they say, or they might disagree with what you said, right? So that's where the kind of the social contract sits. So that's it, ADR. So therefore, if you do this, and if you write the ADR, as Diana Montalian will talk about, you write the ADR as a process of thinking, because as we all know as architects, which is one of the other things you learn as you become an architect, writing helps you think. So if you help and coach people who maybe are, so architects will still be making these decisions. There is the systemic need to make clarity at the cross team level. But if teams are doing it, then you can help them write an ADR and help them think. And so you can not just like tell them what you think they should do with regards to Java versus C#. You can also say, oh, your context needs to be a bit clearer. You need, you've not mentioned the fact that our environments are immutable. That's a key point of this. The reason why we would take option 1 as opposed to option 2, you should put it in here. Or you should speak to this person. They will have good advice or whatever. So we can support those less experienced. We can obviously see who was consulted because we've got the things on the wiki. And we know about all decisions. Cool things you can do, you don't need to, but it's easy to subscribe to a page or watch a page. So if you're an architect, you can just watch the whole space or watch the parent page where all these things are sitting, and then you'll get, if it succeeds, you'll get a spectacularly large amount of emails. So then you can kind of start filtering, or you can put bots on. I've seen people do things and they can put things in Slack. So you can get all of these kind of things. This can become a lot more asynchronous and a lot more kind of, it turns out lots of people like time to think, so they can read and then they can think to themselves as opposed to having to do stuff in real time, which again, in my experience, drives really good architecture. So this is good. So this is another pause moment, if anybody has.
How
Yes.
do dependencies between decisions get captured in that sort of the granularity and?
It's a good question. So I would explicitly refer to them in the context, because there's a thing I didn't even realize until I was writing the book. Michael Nygaard says the consequences of the decision, of the option you select, form basically the context of the decisions that follow it. There's a lot in, for a very short blog post, Michael Nygaard's post is very interesting. So if I would sometimes, it's either clear because it's clear from the context, but if it isn't, I'll definitely link it in. If a decision supersedes a previous decision, hardcore say this is superseded by this ADR. So actually ADR should, this is obvious to everyone, but ADR should be point in time and immutable. You don't go back and reopen an ADR. If you redecide, leave the decision that you made, but you change the status to superseded, and then you create a new ADR which refers heavily back to the old one so you don't repeat yourself. But you make clear the changing circumstances or why what you thought was going to be this amazing decision didn't work because it's very expensive, or it turns out that some part of Azure doesn't scale like you thought it would, or something like that. So that's, so you can get, and this is, I mean, this is kind of not part of the talk, but you still need, and I don't talk about this, you still need some form of architectural knowledge system. Diana Montalian we'll talk about when she talks about this all the time, which is nicely structured by C4, or there's 4+1 models if you're old as me that you can remember. Like you need that kind of thing to give people the story of what the current state of the architecture is. This is the immutable change log, which is the story of why it got to where it is now, which is super useful. So if you can read through these things, and if they're nice and small with good titles, and you can read, if you only want to read the top 2 sections, read the top 2 sections. If you want to know later on, did we ever consider using Rust? You can find out if you ever considered using Rust. And you can see the comments about who said we should use Rust. So that's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful for like learning about your architecture, incredibly powerful for onboarding people. I've used it really successful with scale-ups. People were fed up of saying, we're not doing this because of these 7 reasons. They retrospectively wrote a bunch of ADRs because they were like, these are decisions which have led us to where we are now. The decision had already been made, so there was arguably no point in doing it, but it just made it clear to new joiners why why have you used Python? Well, 1997, there was a lot of Python developers in Argentina, and that was where we were hired. So that's, and they're like, oh, okay, I get it. So they would do that kind of thing. So, any other questions before Martin Fowler drops a bomb on this in the next section?
Across a big set of ADRs,
Yeah.
would you not find that there are insights and patterns and principles even that are sort of hidden in them?
Yes.
And if you expect everyone, because I'm sure you're going to talk about it, one of the snags with ADRs is you get a lot of them very quickly.
Yeah, especially if the more successful you are, the more you.
Exactly. Everyone jumps on the bandwagon and it's great because you get all this knowledge.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about, you just talked about knowledge base. You sort of need to abstract some knowledge out of the ADRs to make
100%.
it more.
So I wasn't going to talk, like, this is a very good question. This is why I paused for questions. Yes, you totally can. Things that I've done. So for example, in the non-fictitious company where they'd hired a lot of Argentinian Python developers to build something and then pivoted various times in their architecture, some of the original developers who are now the senior kind of architects, in their they would give advice, and it would be long advice. We explicitly pulled out things. We were like, right, this is more than just the story of why you shouldn't use Django. There's a lot of stuff in here. So there was one where it was like, there was an implicit principle, which was favor autonomous teams over everything else. And so Costi, I will name Costi because there's a blog post which names Costi. Costi would say, this is all very well, and I don't disagree, but when we did this 7 years ago, it created this. So we took that out and we pulled it into explicit things, explicit principles, and other things in the architecture to make this kind of stuff very clear. Because it's all trade-offs, right? They were like, right, these are, if you do this, these are the good points. These are the 7 reasons that hate yourself. So we extracted that. Other ones would be implicit NFR. So another client was like, if I have to debug another thing at 3 o'clock in the morning, which and none of our events, because it was an event-driven system, none of our events have a transaction ID or a trace ID or correlation ID. This was just a random developer. So this was the classic example of anyone who decided, like, I'm fed up being around for 3 hours trying to trace through events and writing weird queries in Elasticsearch. So they did this. It was an implicit ADR, which was there's a schema for, we need to agree a very simple schema for our correlation IDs. So again, we extracted that. So what I've ended up doing, you'll discover there are implicit assumptions, just like you say, right, about these things. You can pull those out. You might also get signals that the architecture is not as clear as you think it is, the broader architectural system. This isn't in the talk, but as someone who's trying to maintain the overall system architecture, this is amazing. You're like, why are people asking about this over and over again? Yep. So you could go to the fact that everyone's stupid, or you could go to the fact that maybe it's not as obvious as I think it is. They don't spend 3 hours a day with Costi. So you can pull it out, and that's where it would, like I say, I like the word knowledge architecture, because we build knowledge systems, which is the kind of socio-technical system, right? That's how you ensure far greater opportunity and chance of what's in someone's head being the same as what's in everyone else's heads, and also getting down into code. That's when you feel high-performing teams. That's when you, like, people do designs and then they tell you they implemented this without telling you they had to change 17 things because it wasn't exactly like they thought it was when you draw on a whiteboard. So this kind of stuff is super important.
Are you able to see the questions that are coming up in the
Yeah, sorry, I'm not missing
the chat questions, comments?
intelligent committee. Yes, like it totally is. Like Peter was asked, is this like an intelligent committee? It is. The reason this works is because you need accountability, and ADRs give you accountability. So that kind of works, but you get typically the right people on the right things at the right time, because another curse of architecture is everyone thinks it's important, so everyone's invited to all meetings all the time, which makes everyone perfect. Then it seems like a conversational the combination or the complete negation of it, no system to reflect an order structure. So that's a very good question about commons law. It goes to the point of like everyone, what you can do is, and I've even seen people create lightweight social decision records. Lots of these decisions will be very close to which things belong to which team. Sometimes that's just an ADR to like transfer a microservice from one team to another, or refactor a microservice to split it up. You want teams to be being able to be autonomous and independent, so you can get them. And this again, you can coach them as an architect. You can say, why is this decision so big? Why do you have to bring in 17 people into all of these decisions? That's maybe a signal that the fact that our architecture, our socio-technical architecture is not mapping onto our desirable kind of independent autonomous teams. So you can do all that kind of stuff. And if you're purely just restructuring teams, then that's where I've seen people use social decision records with the same format. It's just like, we're not doing an architecture thing, we're doing a teams thing. Cruise control makes it a very wide take of groups. Oh, I'll leave that. I'll come back to that because Martin Fowler complains about the same thing as the first one. What has been the reaction of companies thinking about risk? Centralized bottlenecks are caused by lack of trust. Very good point. So that's where CFRs, thought works, non-functional requirements, which I'm contractually obliged to call cross-functional requirements. Those are the non-negotiables. It's like, we can't decide, well, sometimes some companies can decide to break the rules and break the regulations. That is definitely not where I want to be as an architect, and definitely not where anyone who's writing code should be. And arguably, as a thought worker, I'd be like, maybe everyone should follow the regulations. But the CFRs are where you can put those things and say, this is a hard requirement. We cannot send people's data to a different place. We need to be GDPR compliant. If we need to be PCI compliant, we need to do things. That's not the place for a principle. Like, it's not like it'd be nice if we're PCI compliant. It's like, we need to be, these are the core things. So those are the key things. Then, and this again isn't in the talk, but if you want to make it easy, you can pave a road, AKA build a developer platform, and you can say, right, these are the if we want you to only ever deploy Docker containers which are signed for this environment into this environment, you can put something in a pipeline, which means that only things that have been signed with the appropriate keys can go into an environment. So you build things to make it easy for people to be compliant. Really well. So yeah, risk is super important. What's cool is when this works and you get people like product managers or risk managers or something. I mean, there's a talk that the first company I tried this with, they did a talk at InfoQ. They had screenshots of actual comments from people on some of the ADRs that I wrote, which were a bit exciting to read. But like, there were some people who were very unhappy about some of the stuff we were doing, and it was amazing. So like, oh, we didn't even know that this was a thing. Because they were in the insurance market. There was things you just can't do. We didn't know. We did know after they told us. So getting people who are in regulatory, I mentioned Costi, that was a Bitcoin bank. There was a lot of things that their whole business proposition, their whole product strategy was to be like boring, predictable, trustworthy Bitcoin, which in these days is an exciting prospect, but that was their USP, right? So they were like, regulatory need to be very aware of all of these things. They need to be very comfortable. So they would give advice, and we're like, okay, cool. And regulatory were quite motivated to do this because they're typically the people who go to prison if the rules are broken. So they were like, it's very clear. This is what you're allowed to do. This is what you're not allowed to do. And developers typically, or even architects, were like, we had no idea that that was a law. We're very glad you told us, and we're now going to respect that and do those things.
Mark Woodman has just come up with something.
Sorry? I'm going to come back to that one at the end. Oh, Mark. Right, I'm going to come back to those because I think that we're going to talk about the failure patterns in a minute. So, I mentioned Martin Fowler. I better speed up, so otherwise I'll take everyone's time. Martin Fowler said, this is amazing, but it sounds like you'll be speaking, like you said, you're going to move faster, but it sounds like you're just going to spend all your time speaking to people. Martin Fowler was correct. So, in the best tradition of Martin Fowler, we are now going to refactor the system. So, as in typically as you would expect, refactoring, we're not going to change what it does, but we are going to change how we do it. And so the way to do this is add something called an architectural. An architectural advice form, very similar, an architectural review board, because we're doing the advice process. No one's reviewing, no one's giving permission. You're just offering advice. So typically, and it's interesting, I've seen some places use this and like it because it brings everyone together and it gets all the right people offering advice in public in front of each other and having these design decisions with the kind of ego, I need to be right and you need to be wrong thing removed, because I don't need to convince you. I can't, if it's your decision, I can't tell you to not do this or like argue you into the ground, but I'm motivated to tell you what I think. It works really well. Other people are like, I'd prefer to be fully async. Some companies don't even want any of these things. You don't need to do it, but it can work really well. So regular meeting, half an hour or an hour every week, depending on how long you want to do it. What it is for the awareness of decisions at the very least. And if you want, you can do design, you can ask for and offer advice in these sessions. If someone offers advice verbally, then they're responsible for writing it down in the ADR, so you've still got the flexibility. But what happens is you get this, in my experience, architecture minus the egos or minus the fact that it's my responsibility. It's clear who the responsibility is, so there's no kind of jockeying for position because someone doesn't want to be held accountable. Unless you raise the ADR, you're not accountable. It's very clear who the accountable person is. So you get an incredibly rich conversation, which to me was interesting. And because you've got a rich conversation, and it seems to be, in my experience, less ego-driven, it's a safer place for people who are moving into architecture to listen and to understand and ask clarifying questions. Rita, my editor, has written into my book as a persona. Rita would ask annoyingly clarifying questions when I was writing the book. Rita is there in the book as a developer who goes, I'm not sure I understand this. Can you make it clear to me? Which then highlights something that's not, kind of implicit, or there's something like Owen just said, something which some of us assume we all know, but we don't all know because some of us have been here a long time. So you can get all of that stuff and it builds a safer environment for these things. Other things that I do based on reading, Don Reitman's, Principles of Project Development Flow. If you are responsible for the overall architecture, you want to have good flow of decisions and you want the right people to be involved at the right time. That means you need to manage the long tail decisions. Some decisions will still be big and hairy and take a long time. If you're a systems architect, you really, really want to focus your time there. You don't want to focus your time on the nice small decisions which are tightly scoped and everyone's agreeing and high-fiving. The ones where there feels like there's some heat and some skin in the game, that's where you want to be. So we track like what decisions got made last week, what decisions have been sitting around for a long time, what decisions have been superseded. That's all the information. So suddenly, as a systems architect or someone who's responsible for the whole thing, it gets a lot better. I've even seen where CTOs have come. I have always like coach CTOs and stuff to not talk. The old Amazon principle, if you talk at the start, everyone will magically do what you say. But if you talk at the end, then you can really kind of give super injections of clarity and stuff. So quickly, I thought I was really smart. It turned out I just reverse engineered what Ruth Malland had been talking about for a long time. So Ruth Malland said this: in order for an architecture to be successful, it's very much about ensuring that conversations that are needed to be happening are happening, not always initiating them, nor always helping to folks to navigate them, but ensuring they happen and guiding when needed. The other options or methods are available. This, in my experience, is the best way for me to do. I'm being paid to be there as someone who's supposed to be guiding these things. This is the best way that I've found to do them. It works with. So, all good, how to fail. So I'm in danger of running over slightly, but I've only got 4 points on how to fail. But has anyone got any? Or we keep going, right?
We've got about another 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect. I can definitely talk about how to fail back. But has anyone got? This is why I'm saving up some of the questions because they're a bit to fail. But does it make sense so far? Why naive? This is what the book is like. This basic stuff plus. Let's not be naive. Human beings are complicated and software is difficult. The remaining 400 pages is the extra stuff.
Little observation.
Yeah.
Some years ago, probably more than 2 decades ago, I read about something called architecture by walking about. But nowadays we've got these globally distributed teams. You can't do it. So I think this is a very good substitute.
No, exactly. Because this is the thing. And this is because you're right. And like I used to work with a delivery person who was like, they missed when COVID happened, they could hear teams that were working well, or they could hear, they're like, that team is too quiet. Because there's some kind of hum or buzz about a team that is doing things. These days, memes on Slack is always a good sign that things are working quite well, unless they're very negative memes and they're like, maybe we should speak to human resources. But you like to say it's very different. And if you don't even know these things are happening, it's very hard to know what's going on because, as it says in the big bold white paper, you can't see architecture, you can't see software architecture, the one that's running election. You do not have enough, or I do not have enough time for football. Occasionally, if I'm very lucky, I'll glimpse at some GitHub pages. But I don't, maybe I'll wonder why Bill's failed. That's as close as I get. With this, you can see the thing happening. This is why, like I said, the CTO used to come to one of these things. They spoke once, and the only time they spoke was, well, that's not true. They were like generally positive, but the one time they offered advice was everyone had decided that they all hated New Relic. Apologies to New Relic. They all hated New Relic and they were going to use open tracing. And the CTO put a hand up and said, we've just paid for a site license for 5 years for New Relic. And so despite the fact that you all think it sucks, I'm advising you as the CTO that we have made this investment and we acknowledge that it doesn't do everything you want it to do. But here are the extra things which people weren't aware of would do. So therefore, and there, that was the one thing that people were like, okay, cool. Which was good, right? So then they'd communicated a message that nobody was really happy with. They'd acknowledged all of the feelings about New Relic, which I have seen work very well, just to be very clear. But then people understood, again, they would very rarely get that kind of interaction with the CTO. And they very rarely, like, they just complain, oh, someone's just paid for a license for software that everyone hates. That conversation had a chance to happen, which was super powerful. Mm-hmm. Other times people just sit there and just listen and stuff. So it's very, very good. Any other, I'm just going to check to make sure I'm not.
No more messages.
That's good, right? Okay, I'm going to come back to those at the end. So the next thing, the last part of the talk is, I'm very aware that one of the old failings of architecture is you think really hard, you draw it on a whiteboard, you build it, like you do the thing, right? You code it. But then you don't pay attention to, so as somebody said, I don't pay attention to the feedback. So I'm now going to tell you when you run this, what happens. It may not work. So here are the things I've seen. My book has many, many other reasons why this can go wrong. These are the four big failure patterns. Number one, bad decisions. Bad decisions is not the failure pattern you think it is, but it will be if you're an architect, you will, I'll guarantee it. I always very frequently see this, and I have felt this. Is an example in the book of me. Because you are now no longer able to tell people what to do things, you see people about to make what you think is a terrible decision. So in the book, and this was at OpenGI because they're happy to be named, there was a team that decided that despite the fact that we were using Kubernetes and EKS, or the Azure version of EKS, which I can't remember the name of, Azure or Kubernetes, they were not going to do that. They were not going to use C#. They were going to use TypeScript, and they were going to use lambdas. You're like, this is a terrible idea. Here's a list of me and the other chief architect. Here are 17 reasons why this will fail, because we're very senior and we're very experienced and we know. And it was a ThoughtWorks team. So I said to my client kind of peer, I can tell them not to follow the process. And Pete rightly pointed out, if you do that, the whole thing falls apart. If you tell everyone they have the power to decide, and then you're like, you can only decide when I agree with you, this is not working. So they did do it. I was wrong. Turned out that they were right. The thing that specifically they were building a customer onboarding part to the website. So it was run very frequently. So there was no point for this stuff to be provisioned all the time. It was replacing a spreadsheet driven process, which used to take 3 months. So the fact that it might take like 30 seconds to warm up for a customer was not a problem, right? Because previously they'd have to fill in a spreadsheet, which would take them forever, and then they'd email it, and then 3 months later they get a response. So it was a night and day compared to this thing. But the cost of running it was super, super low. It would, like, if there was no customers, nothing would be provisioned. It was a really nice, clean architecture. And the team loved building TypeScript. Bill uses me because I don't understand that, but they loved it. And so therefore, just the general mood of the team, which is, you know, maybe not directly related to architecture, but they felt in control and they were very aware of it. To make me feel better, and again, this isn't in the talk, but they actually ran spikes. The spike is basically, and so an Agile XP spike. A spike is basically a question that you ask before you write an ADR. If you look at the structure of a spike that's recommended, it looks very similar to an ADR. So spike's the question, the ADR is the answer to the question. They ran spikes. Turns out that I was slightly out of date. Startup times for lambdas are not as bad as they used to be. It turns out. So the failure pattern here is not letting go. Really hard. Because there will still be bad decisions. If there are bad decisions, then you need to step in and go, just like Owen went. If there was this kind of shared general understanding of things, then they would probably be deciding, because there is this shared, software is a social act, right? Very few people are determined to go off on their own direction and just make everyone else's lives hell. And then it's a bigger problem than a software problem, right? Then it's maybe an HR problem. So people want to do this stuff. So there's probably some lack or some missing information in the general architecture, which is making the fact that these teams think that this is going to be a good idea and it's a bad idea. So that's the thing. So therefore, if things do go wrong, then what you can do is say, right, what are we missing from the overall architecture? What do we need to break in? What understanding do we need to share? How do we learn to fail fast, et cetera, et cetera? So that's the lesson there. Failure pattern 2 really is a failure pattern. Old guard equals the new guard is you've freed up, you've been very magnanimous, and you've said anyone can decide. And I'd love as many ADRs to bloom as possible. And you look after a month and you're like, there's nobody doing ADRs. I have discovered through bitter personal experience, you can say one set of words with your mouth, but you can exude with your entire body language and personality. You better make the right decision or I'm going to get really upset. So, and like, I don't know, because we're technologists, sometimes I've seen other clients do this and I'm like, oh my God, you said one set of words and you have communicated a very different message. And this is the signal that that's happened. Another signal is just human beings they're like, why is this, but this does not happen. No one ever says you can do anything, not anything, but you can do the thing that you think is best. So Pete, in the talk that he and Elena did at InvoQ when they talked about the first 4 years of doing this at OpenGI, the first 2 or 3 weeks, no one believed us. Then they were like, oh, they're really serious. So then it all happened. But so you need to watch out for if it's the same people, that is a good signal that people don't feel safe enough to do this. And maybe they don't know, they're not sure, they're not aware enough of the overall system architecture, right? So they don't feel confident doing it. So then you figure out what it is. So you speak to people and you find out what's missing. So number 3 is another signal is off the grid decisions. So off the grid decisions are decisions which are not written down as an ADR, might not even be made explicitly. They're definitely not being written down as ADRs. They're definitely not coming to the architecture advice forum. Maybe this is a signal that they didn't realize it was an architectural decision. So there's a thing I've added to the site that goes with the book. Set of criteria, which is this is an architecturally significant decision. Set of criteria. Maybe they wanted to make the decision really badly, but they knew that me, because I really hate TypeScript and I'm really not keen on lambdas, they thought they'd do it under the covers because it was easier that way. So again, the failure pattern is in the people who are facilitating and curating the conversations, which is a large part of architecture. That's the problem. Off the grid is not great. So you need to go and fix it, right? But then you're like, right, what did you not know? Why did you not feel comfortable? Why did you not feel safe? That's the thing that you can do. So therefore, learning yourself as the person who's facilitating is super important. And then you can reverse engineer the ADR. People have reverse engineered ADR since the dawn of time. So, and then the last one before I go to the questions. This is the hard failure pattern. There's one client I haven't rolled this out at, who I will not name. The levels of trust were so low. The danger of this being weaponized, very high. So we didn't do it. I'm not going to name it. But if you work there, you definitely know. You don't know, but like, I don't think anyone here does work there. But like, you can tell if there's really low trust. However, what I've seen every single place, because people are like, this probably won't work. In my experience, if you trust people to do a good job, because people in software, smart people, and we want to build good software that's easy to live with, and this is the thing I want to write about in my next book is like, we spend a lot of time, maybe not architects. Architects spend a lot of time trying to shepherd and herd these code bases. People who work in teams delivering software spend a significant portion of their lives staring at this stuff. They want it to be hospitable. They want to understand it. They want it to be supple and you know, a good place to be and do their work. You don't want it to be a big ball of mud. So if you make the space and leave people with the, you know, give them the support and facilitate those conversations, I am always overwhelmed with like the stuff that comes up. The book is written for two audiences. The book is written for stressed architects, me, and for people who want to be an architect but don't know. They've read Neil Ford's books and Mark Richards' books, and they've done stuff, but they don't know how to find the bottom rung of the ladder. This gives those people the bottom rung of the ladder. They're still not software architects, but there are people who are doing and practicing architecture, and then they might choose to become an architect whose remit is broader than one team or whatever. That is incredibly powerful. So if you get that, and then people below them, so you kind of there's people who are people who will step up to deciding. Below them, there's people who will step up to offering advice, and below them, there's people who are like, I didn't understand how this worked, but now I've seen 3 very smart people have a very good, open, constructive debate about the benefits of asynchronous versus synchronous, or some weird edge case of something that HTTP does that someone remembers from 1997. That's incredible. That never happens in public, right? That happens in architecture review boards or in rooms after hours at work when people are struggling trying to fix stuff. Having that in the open and writing it down is incredibly powerful. So, quick summary: how to fail, bad decisions, old guard, new guard, obviously. Decisions, no trust. The key thing is, and this is why I use the slightly triggering way, it seems to get me invited to places like the BCS. The reason I use the word commune, the reason I use kind of like all the memes and the stuff, nobody's actually living in an ivory tower. The other meme of people down in the trenches, right? Nobody's, like a hands-on architect, literally kind of at the coalface all the time. They're memes, but there is a kind of general need, in my experience, to kind of change these things. And so that's why these word communes, there's a revolutionary aspect to this, but not like that far to everything. It's a return, just to the point of the question at the start. It's a return and a kind of suggestion to reset, like Agile, reset things, DevOps, reset things, product thinking, reset things. It's a request or a suggestion or a kind of plea to say, what if we reset things? We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but because there's tons of good architectural thinking, but have we kind of overstructured ourselves for various reasons? Can we keep all of the good stuff, but then somehow get this, melt the kind of frozen structure around some of these things to figure out? And then to the question about Conway works very, very, very definitely, but you can't do Conway by thinking really hard. You need to pay attention to having this living social organism, right? So therefore you want to give that thing. So hence fostering a commune. Last key point, because sometimes people think this and I'm not saying it. This doesn't mean everyone should do architecture. If you are happy and never want to do any architecture and are just happy having a conversation with someone who's already made the decision and you're implementing it, some people love doing that. That's cool. You're not obliged to decide, but if you wanted to decide, this is the way that you could step up and take decisions. It's also, and I'm very aware of this, and this caused a bit of trouble with O'Reilly, it's very lightweight. It's not supposed to be super complicated. You can bolt on tons of things. There's a bit in a chapter which is like how this relates to TOGAF, because it does fit in with TOGAF. Because I was terrified that someone from TOGAF would come along and say, this is flying in the face. It's completely compliant with the open groups, open agile architecture approaches. But the point is, it's light because the human beings and the culture of your organization and the nature of your code bases and the product you're trying to build and all of these kind of things, that's what fills the gap. The skills of the people who work there, the motivations. Like you employ a lot of people who have kids and have to work 9 to 5. That's a different kind of culture than someone who's 21-year-olds Python hackers in Argentina, right? Who've got infinite spare time. This maps and molds to that. And that's the key thing, right? You don't want to be over restrictive because it maps to what you've got. And that's the point. It's decentralized, it's kind of emergent. That's the kind of architectures that we're building. And as you fashionably at the moment, it might go in a different direction, but it maps onto, it's kind of culturally, socio-technically similar to the things we're trying to do. So that doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It just means it maps quite nicely. The thing I talked about at the start is kind of the impedance mismatch of this hierarchical, centralized way of doing things with a decentralized, horizontally, elastically scalable, reactive and responsive architecture. That for me is what we want. So I think this is it. Oh no, this is a bit. And then this is me boasting. I got on the tech radar, so that's why you should listen to me. I'm only in adopt. Oh no, sorry, lightweight ADRs are in adopt. I'm in trial. So this might disappear. Things can enter the edge of the radar and then disappear very quickly. And hopefully if you like this, then read the blog post and find out if you like it. So there's a book, I mentioned the book. It's 460 pages. It's a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. Turns out I have more opinions than I thought. If you want a 17-page version, that's the thing that Martin gave me the feedback on. So that's that. The book is available on O'Reilly. If you've never had a free pass for O'Reilly, or if you know how to create a new email address to get a new free pass for O'Reilly, that will give you a free month on O'Reilly, where you can access everything, including the book. And there's a website which is slowly kind of growing with additional things because people keep asking me annoyingly relevant questions which are not in the book. It adds new things to the website. And that's it.
I have one question on.
Go, do you want to read out the
Two now. So this needs to be read slowly because there's several thoughts in it. Ian Cornwall wants to ask a yes/no question to the whole group,
Okay, good.
if we have time. He says, I asked the question about risk and the answer suggested it should be enough to write down the non-negotiables. In my company, that wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be trusted. More assurance is sought, mainly with cybersecurity risks in mind.
Good question. Good
What
point.
proportion of us feel empowered to make this kind of change of our approach to architecture decision-making, or at least could envisage senior colleagues doing so? Hands up if you don't and can't.
There's another thing I need to mention because I didn't read that part of the question, but yeah, it's a good question.
Read it again, please.
Yeah. How many of us feel empowered to make this kind of change of approach to architecture decision-making, or at least could envisage senior colleagues doing it? Hands up if you don't, or you can't.
It depends. I mean, if you've got something that works, then why change it?
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm definitely not saying change it for the sake of it, right? I
think it has kind of organizational relationships, doesn't it? The structure, the kind of the role of the architects and kind of how things are put together, how projects are put together on clients and things like that. I mean, I do quite a lot of these things already, and I have people in my team, good sort of developers and things like that, would contribute to ADRs and put pieces together so that I can kind of come in and go, great, you've thought about all of these things.
Yeah.
I think it probably does assume that there is someone who wants to dip into architecture a bit in the teams, which you touched on. And I feel like that's a bit of a leap.
Yeah, definitely.
Sort of say that across all teams.
Yeah.
So I think, in reference to that, I'd see that as a bit of a blocker. In some, it would work quite well. In some, people would go, that's another thing for me to do. And then are we just playing with time? I think sometimes as an architect, you can struggle to explain what your time is spent on and how you split time up across teams. When in reality, maybe another architect could be a solution over trying to spread out the workload.
Oh yeah, totally.
Teams, particularly if they're quite small teams as well.
Yeah. And so this is the thing, it works nicely at a team level. Like I've typically, whenever I've rolled it out, I roll it out with one or two teams, and like you say, the ones you can see the ones who are like desperate for this kind of, because they're the ones who basically finishing your sentences. You're like, okay, let's do that. The thing I didn't mention, you're right about the risk thing, because if you've got the NFRs, it doesn't mean they're there. The other key thing, which again is from Principles of Project Development Flow, until you've put this in code and tested it, it's a guess. You're hoping that this will work. So the key thing is, and this whole chapters on how to make smaller decisions and how to get them into code rapidly, and then learn from either running tests or getting into production, depends on your regulatory environment. That's the key thing, closing the feedback loop. You're adding more feedback earlier on, but the big thing is like you get the feedback from doing these things. And that's proper Principles of Project Development Flow. And so if you can't, because of regulations, spikes are just as good, because a spike is real code, but not a proof of concept. So something small that you can really, to quote Ian Cartwright, who used to be a thought worker, code wins arguments. If no one can decide if this is or isn't risky, don't put it in prod. Maybe put it in prod, put it in a prod-like environment, find out if it'll work. It's, So different regulations are super important. It has worked, like I say, it's worked in various regulated environments, but then they make sure that the right people are involved at the right time and they get the right feedback.
Yeah, Ian Cornwell's made an observation on that. This risk aversion is in the last 5 years due to increased cybersecurity risk.
Yeah.
5 years ago, we had the autonomy to do this.
So this is the thing, actually. So cyber people have been most, and one of these people was at OpenGI, actually. They were fed up of always being brought in at the end to say no after people had invested lots of time and effort and had literally built things. And then they're like, well, you can't do that because it doesn't work. So this doesn't negate them doing that. But if you get InfoSec people involved at the very start, they're very good at going, we are definitely not allowed to do that, or this is a terrible idea, but if you do this. So then they're not just the Department of No, which many of them hate being. They're involved in the design, they're involved in input into these things, and that works. Sure, some InfoSec people love to be the Department of No, and that's their entire raison d'etre. So they quite like doing that. But like most of the ones I've worked with are like, crikey, someone's actually like regulatory. Someone hasn't asked us to approve something after we've done it. They're like, we have 3 options for how we would do this. Please tell us which one would fit better. That's super powerful. So to the point about like architecture and stuff, you can do this as an individual architect. You can say, I'm going to explicitly use the advice process. I want to seek your advice. It works really well too.
So I mentioned about it being better. Isn't a lot of it about if you take a situation where things weren't working and then you move them to a situation where things are working, then really, if you can get them to a working state, the particular techniques you use don't really matter because the jump is so big.
Yeah. So I've done it. So I've done it with places where this was not the problem. Now it's just my default. Yeah. It doesn't mean I'm going to do it, but it's like.
But do you get invited, presumably as a consultant, you don't get invited in places where things are already working?
No, that's true. This is very true. That's like, definitely don't. The reason I like being a consultant is they get invited to like big things that are failing. Because if it's a small thing, then I'm too expensive. And if it's going well, then why are you paying me to do it? So yeah, that's exactly right. But I have had lots of feedback from people, so not me, where clients companies where ThoughtWorks has never been anywhere near them. And this seems to be working. Or people have said, we're already doing some flavor of this with, so maybe they're not doing ADRs, maybe they're doing RFCs or whatever. So I spoke to someone at Stack Overflow. They said that they're doing the equivalent from, they'd taken first principles and got to an equivalent. None of this, it was a similar kind of thing. But what they'd done is they'd opened up the conversations. They decentralized the accountability and responsibility for decisions.
So if you have a method that gets the sheep going in the same direction, then that's a good method. And then comparing different methods is really, that's all a bit pointless anyway. And you've got to change things from the situation where it's not working to where it's working. And that jump is so big that everything else is minor.
So the thing I would say is, this is chapter 14 in my book. So my book is a love letter, a quote from my editor, love letter for 2 books. Don Reinertson's Principles of Project Development Flow and Christopher Alexander's Patterns of Pattern Language. And this is again going to go into my new book. Pattern language is hierarchical and structured top-down. The latter parts of the book are the kind of reverse forces, the forces back on architecture. So therefore, you're not just guiding people. What you want to do is take the feedback loops from people who have done lower level architecture, or done architecture at the closer to the production systems, and feed that back.
Aren't you doing what I call quoting the wisdom of the ancients as a way of sort of gaining social cachet, of promoting and so on? That actually it's a way of promoting it. I mean, it's an effective way, but you can work anyone. It doesn't, as long as you have a technique that works, that's what counts.
No, so this is my point. My point is, if
you have to sell the idea.
Yeah, if you just direct your software, in the complex world of software these days, you can't just direct it and hope that it'll get there, because A, the destination might change.
Okay.
B, you need that, again, to the feedback loop. It's not just the feedback loops of was this individual's decision good? It's the feedback loops of the general direction of travel of where we're going is no longer the way that's either A, the route to get there is not as optimal as it could be, or the destinations change.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that technique is bad. I'm just saying that you quote the wisdom of the ancients as a social. It's important to get the sheep going in the right direction.
I don't think it's sheep. I think it's like, it's it's autonomous teams that are self-managing and self-directing. So that's the thing you want. If you've done this, this is why I like it. If you've done this well, you don't just get teams that are kind of they're all of the same like mind.
But
You've
you
got
have to
teams
get
that
them,
are
you have to get them
sensing
to sign up. So you have to get social acceptance within the team.
I think, yeah, so you do, that's very true. But I think most people are happy to do this because I think the boundary between an architect, like this is the eternal debate, right? The boundary between an architectural decision and a design decision is always a little bit fun because you're deciding to implement things. And so therefore you could be doing this at various different levels. It's just the level of implement. So you want as many people to be taking those and consciously taking those decisions as possible, because then the system, the human system and the software system that they build can react in a complex, emergent way to the complex environment that software.
We're agreeing on that the system works and however, but it coming back to the fashion idea that you have to, it's a fashionable idea which aids getting everybody going in the same direction. They can see it's fashionable, we'll go this way.
Yeah.
And so the big jump is from not working to working rather than the variation between the methods.
Yeah, it could be. Yes, exactly. So there are, like I say, as far as I'm aware, Stack Overflow are doing, the first principles have led them to an equivalent way of doing this. So that's the big, but like I say, the big thing is it's like something that's less directed is more responsive. That's the biggest win of this is like, A, you're not the one sole person is responsible for everything, or some named group of people is responsible. But B, you've got this.
You're still selling the idea. And I'm happy with the idea that's been sold, but I'm talking about how you sell the idea.
Yeah, but this is like, yeah, so we've got like, I've written a book, so I've got, this is the way I sell it, but other people would sell it in different ways. But
I'm gonna wind things up at this point. Thanks everybody for listening, and the food's out there, so don't let it get cold. Let me thank Andrew again for a very fascinating.